I was literally opening my safe to get some classified documents and a classified hard drive when the plane hit the building. We had executed 2 or 3 evacuation drills. Each organization had a specific point where they would meet up outside the Pentagon. Ours was immediately outside the child care center. And then we were told that there was another plane heading towards DC, and that was the one that ultimately was taken down by those tremendously brave people in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Since our gathering point, our meeting point was right outside the child care center, we actually went in there and getting cribs and young children, moving them away from the Pentagon all the way to the very outside of the parking lot.
In a corporate world where all employees have great leaders with no egos that create fun cultures where people can do their best work, the employees and companies thrive while doing great things for the customers, themselves, and each other.
Well, we know that rarely happens. I'm Jeff Palacio. I have been a leader for over 40 years for every t-shirt size company, from small 16 employees to extra large over 1 million. Please join me while I interview outstanding leaders that will share stories of great leadership and not so great. It will help you become a better leader while poking fun at all the crazy shit that happens in corporate America.
Hi, I'm Joe Deshawn, and welcome to the Corporate Couch with Jeff Palacio. Today, Jeff is interviewing David Komar. David is the president of EDA Inc., a top-of-the-house human capital firm helping companies build a compelling company culture that will last. He is also an international keynote speaker, an author, and a retired U.S. Army general. Prior to founding EDA Inc., David spent 31 years in the U.S. Army in a variety of leadership positions, retiring as a brigadier general. You can learn more about David at edainc.io. Let's listen as Jeff talks to David.
Dave, I'd like to welcome you on the Corporate Couch this afternoon.
Well, thanks for having me, Jeff. Been looking forward to this.
Yeah, very excited. I mean, 31 years in service for the Army, so thank you for your service. Well, I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about that career, but you also have a book coming out on culture, and that's one of my favorite topics in corporate America. So very excited to talk to you today. Let's start with a fun question. Even those people that know you a little bit, Dave, what would surprise them about you? Do you have something you're hiding?
I think that one thing that would surprise people is that I probably haven't traveled, even though I've spent 31 years in the Army and I've been to quite a few countries. I probably haven't traveled to as many countries as a lot of people would think.
So you grew up in upstate New York. I'll have to ask you, have you ever been to the Empire State Building?
I have.
Okay, just wondering, because a lot of people, especially people who live in the city, they've never been to the Empire State Building.
Well, that's funny because I was stationed at the Pentagon 3 different times during my military career for a total of 8 years. And the time when we would actually go see most of the sites was when people would come to visit us.
Exactly.
Other than that, the commute every day, all week long, just would become such a grind. Last thing you wanted to do was get in the car and get in traffic on the weekend.
Exactly. Yeah. I grew up a little closer to New York City than you did, but about an hour. But I had never been to the Empire State Building until my kids were about 6 and 8. And we went on a trip from Kansas City to New York, and we got to go to the top of the Empire State Building. Very fun, but it took me a long time to get there. So you grew up in upstate New York, Elmira, I believe. What was fun for you growing up, Dave?
My dad worked in management for one of the public utilities in New York State, and we moved around every 2 or 3 years or so. I think we've lived one place 4 years, so it kind of got me ready for a career in the Army of moving around. And of course, back then, if you couldn't ride your bike there, you might as well have moved to the other side of the world, because it wasn't like you'd be able to see your old friends. You certainly weren't going to make a long distance phone call, which today is something I think is completely unknown to people. The fact that there used to be long distance calls, and you'd call people late at night or on the weekends because it was cheaper back then.
Oh, yeah.
So we moved around a lot, but really spent as much time as I could outside growing up, just exploring around. We never lived in a major metropolitan area, so there was always woods or a creek or something else nearby that I could explore. So that I really enjoyed that. Lived again mostly in small towns, so it really gave you opportunities to participate in things that you might not have been able to participate because there was just too much competition in that specific area, whether it be music or sports.
Sure. So you went to college in Lafayette College in Pennsylvania, Easton, Pennsylvania. What drove you from upstate New York to Lafayette?
First of all, it was a great school. Still is a great school. In fact, I probably couldn't get accepted into that school today with the way the competition is for it. My dad was actually a graduate of Lafayette. He was a first generation American. Both of his parents immigrated from what's now the very eastern part of Slovakia. They came over to his dad worked in the tanneries at Endicott Johnson Shoe Factory, and so he was able to get an academic scholarship in high school to Lafayette. So he attended there, but really enjoyed my experience there. In fact, when I was the first couple of years I was there, Larry Holmes, the Easton Assassin, was still the undefeated heavyweight champion of the world until he lost to Michael Spinks. And again, being a fairly small town, it's right on the Delaware River, about an hour or so north of Philadelphia. But you'd see Larry walking around town. He bought several businesses. He fixed up quite a few of the buildings. This was early to mid 80s, so the economy in that area was particularly bad at that time. So it was very interesting. He used to the first Saturday of every month, he had renovated the State Theater in Easton, and he used to hold what it was called Larry Holmes Presents, and it was, I don't know, probably 8 or 10 card fight card there, and it was primarily fighters from that trained in his gym there in Easton, and Joe Frazier would bring guys from his gym up from Philadelphia, and it was great. I think it was cost like $3 or something to get in, and you could watch some guys that were just sort of starting out their careers, and some of them you'd see them on TV like years later. So it was a great experience there. Made a lot of great friends, people I'm still in touch with. In fact, some people I do business with.
Yeah. So I know you graduated with a BA in business and economics. Was that your original major?
No, I originally started out as an engineering major. I was an electrical engineering major. And I think a combination of being able to explore different areas and other interests, and my failure of to master differential equations, I think put the end of my engineering academic career. But had a fantastic experience there at Lafayette as an economics and business major.
Yeah, I love that you use differential equations in a sentence still today. I mean, I was a business major in information systems. So if you were a hardcore person, you did computer science, not information system. That was the business, kind of computer degree back in the day. So and I went to Manhattan College in the Bronx, and there was a big engineering school. And trust me, I had less work to do than the engineering majors.
Well, I can still use it in a sentence because occasionally I'll still wake up in a cold sweat with an exam paper in front of me.
Yeah. Do you still have the dream that you forgot to drop that class and the final was the next day? Because I do. So you were in the Reserve Officer Training Corps, the ROTC at Lafayette. What was your decision to pursue that, Dave?
Well, I always knew I wanted to serve. I'd mentioned that my father, his parents being immigrants to this country. My mother's also an immigrant to this country, and my dad mentioned, he went to Lafayette and he had a successful career, very successful career working for New York State Electric and Gas. I mean, we really lived the American dream, and I just wanted to give back. I really didn't have any intention on staying. Maybe I think I was a non-scholarship cadet, so you could tell what kind of student I was. But so I think I had like a 3-year active duty commitment, and I went to Germany. I figured, hey, this would be a great opportunity to travel and see Europe, and also to be in an organization there. This was still Cold War Europe. Being an organization has a mission to fight anytime should the need arise. So that's really why I pursued it, and it just kind of turned out that 31 years later, retired as a brigadier general. And I just kind of made decisions along the way. There were several other times I thought I was going to go do something else, and the Army gave me an opportunity to, whether it was a promotion or an opportunity to go to school, those types of things, that I kind of tipped the scales in the Army's favors for me staying in the Army from that perspective.
And was it always going to be the Army? Did you look at any other branch of the service?
No, I think it was always going to be the Army. All of my dad's brothers, they all served. I think he had one brother, my Uncle John, who'd served in the Navy during World War II. And I think all of his other brothers were in the Army. My dad spent some time in the Army as well. And in fact, he graduated from Lafayette. He went through ROTC there. And a guy named Bob Edwards, with whom my dad played lacrosse, and they were in ROTC together. In fact, they were in the same fraternity together. Bob Edwards has a fairly prominent role in the book "We Were Soldiers Once and Young" that Lieutenant General Hal Moore wrote. It was later turned into a movie, "We Were Soldiers Once."
Wow. Yeah, so when you graduated, you basically went right into the Army as a platoon leader, right? So it looked like you simultaneously or in parallel, you also were getting your master's in arts and management from Webster. Is that kind of the?
Yeah, it was a little bit later. I was a fairly senior captain at that time. That I was in an organization that I was able to pursue it. Webster is gosh, I'm trying to remember how many different installations they're on, but they have satellite campuses. So I was at Fort Jackson, South Carolina at the time, and Columbia, South Carolina. And what was nice was they had courses. I think they only went like 7 or 8 weeks, and they were very condensed courses. So you could kind of pick one up, and then maybe 2 or 3 terms, when we were out training National Guard units in the summer, we wouldn't be able to take courses, but then, could take some later on. And the Army gave me an opportunity at the end of my degree, towards the end of my degree, to just take 6 months and go to school full time to finish my master's degree.
What was a big surprise for you going from like ROTC at Lafayette to being a platoon leader? Like, it has to be something, real worldish that was like, oh, wow, I didn't realize this.
I had phenomenal cadre who are, active duty Army leaders, both senior non-commissioned officers, senior sergeants, and captains and majors in my ROTC program that really did a phenomenal job of preparing us. In fact, while I was in the Army, rarely a day would go by that I didn't think about something that one of them had told me, or I had seen them do, or some experience from that. So they did as good a job as they could, but there is nothing that can prepare you for being put in charge of an organization, of 40 to 50 back then young men, because field artillery was not open to females at the time. That only happened here recently. Whose lives depend on the decisions you make. And that's a very, very sobering thing to think about. And being there really on, at the time, freedom's frontier, right behind the Iron Curtain, just west of the Iron Curtain, having going up to the Czechoslovakian border, conducting reconnaissance of the first positions and the subsequent positions that, according to the battle plans, your organization was going to occupy, and really having to think through that, identifying, all right, when we leave this position, what route are we going to take to the next position? Where can we resupply? If we take casualties, how we're going to evacuate them, things like that. So there's really no substitute. I don't think there's anything that can prepare you for having that level of responsibility thrust upon you willingly. But when you put that on your shoulders, there's really nothing to prepare you for that.
Dave, what do you think the Army, I mean, and obviously, it's gone through many iterations, over its history here, but I mean, what's the kind of the secret to them being such a great teacher of leadership?
At the root of the Army's success is the fact that it's an absolutely positively deliberate system and process that they follow. Are there some ways they could do it differently and it might be better? Sure. And the Army's always adapting how they conduct leader development, how they train and educate leaders within the Army, rely on external resources, graduate schools, things like that. But it's a deliberate process from the day a soldier, whether they're an officer or whether they're enlisted, from the day they report to that very first training assignment, all the way through to their retirement. There's a very deliberate and defined set of schools, experiences, self-development opportunities that are designed to move that individual from where they are up through the rank structure. And the Army commits a tremendous amount of resources. We take, for instance, you look at a brand new soldier, their first day in the Army, they report to their basic training unit. They're going to be trained by Army drill sergeants who are selected as some of the best non-commissioned officers that the Army has. As we realize the importance of and the difficulty of the task of turning a civilian into a soldier, and as well as the fact that that individual is going to be their very first impression, their very first idea of what it is to be a leader in the Army. So the Army commits some of its very, very best people and a lot of resources to ensure that soldiers are trained at all levels and that they receive the necessary leader development throughout their careers.
Yeah, so you're talking about resources. So it looks like, just based on your background in the Army, 31 years, 2 tours of, I don't know how many tours of duty, but you're a veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. So thank you for your service there and protecting our freedom. What role did you have where you had the biggest budget? Because it looked like you had some huge budgets that you were in control of.
Yeah, so I had a few. The very, in control is a sort of a loose, kind of, I'll use that loosely. But my very first job in the Pentagon, I was a major, and I had never been outside an Army brigade before, which is an organization of about 3,000 or 4,000 people down at the tactical level. And I was in an organization called the Program Analysis and Evaluation Directorate. And what we did was we identified what the Army's resourcing plan was going to be for the next 6 years. So, I had a little piece of that. I had some specific areas that it was my responsibility to provide the analysis so that the Army senior leadership could make, have the information that they need and the analysis they need to make the best decision. So that, collectively our organization, had tremendous influence over the entire Army budget for a 6-year period of time. And, my last job in the Army, I was the director of capability development for the Army. So everything from boots to helicopters, medical field dressings to tanks. We were responsible for developing the requirements. What did that piece of equipment, what did it need to be able to provide a soldier is with respect to capability, and to make sure that they all would not only work together, but move the Army on a continuous modernization plan from where it is today to where we wanted to be 20, 25 years from now. Any particular capability gap, there's always many different ways you could solve that, but some ways will help you move from where you are to where you're trying to get to more effectively than others. Some might actually even be a step backwards, even though it's solving a near-term problem. So we were responsible for developing those requirements and prioritizing the entire Army modernization budget, which was about $25 billion a year. So those were probably the biggest. I was the director of Army business operations for a couple of years at the Pentagon. That was my first assignment as a general officer. And, one of the things that we did was we were responsible for the business initiatives that were introduced to the Army Business Council, and looking to industry, to academia, to see what was really best in class processes and procedures and policies out there that we could scale to the Army. There's a lot of interesting things that companies, even a company, big companies, say Microsoft, there's things that they do that don't necessarily scale to, 1.2 million people in 132 different countries at any given time, where at any time someone's life could depend on having a specific resource that they need.
Wow, yeah, it's incredible. Most guests, don't have that type of budget. So I know you said you had a couple different stints and different roles at the Pentagon. Were you in the Pentagon role in 9/11?
I was a major in the Army Program Analysis and Evaluation Directorate, and in fact, I was working, at my desk, and we had these sort of like 4 cubicles that were together, and there was another officer that I was working with who had just gotten off the phone with his wife, and I couldn't even understand. I couldn't even hear or understand his side of the conversation because he was speaking in Spanish. And when he got off the phone, he says, "Yeah," he goes, "My wife just told me that a second plane had hit the other World Trade Center towers. We had already heard about the first one." And so it became pretty clear right away that this wasn't some sort of aviation mishap, that it was definitely a deliberate attack. And then I was literally opening my safe to get some classified documents and a classified hard drive that I kept in there for working on sensitive materials when the plane hit the building. Providentially, I would call it, our organization, because we hadn't done it in probably over a year, in the month prior, we had executed, I think, about 2 or 3, I think it was 3 evacuation drills, where we would leave our office, we would go to each organization, had a specific a point where they would meet up outside the Pentagon. Ours was immediately outside the child care center, and take accountability, figure out who's there, who's not there, if anyone knows where people were. And this was cell phones weren't as ubiquitous as they are today. It wasn't like everybody had a cell phone, and even if you had one inside the building, depending upon where you were, you really couldn't get much coverage. So, we fortunately we had a an individual that worked in our very close small group in our office who wasn't there, but he got outside in another part of the building and was able to call our colonel, our boss, and identify that. And then we were told that there was another plane heading towards DC, and that was the one that ultimately was taken down by those tremendously brave people in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, who sacrificed their lives to save many others. Since our gathering point, our meeting point was right outside the child care center, we actually went in there and started getting cribs and young children and moving them away from the Pentagon all the way to the very outside of the parking lot, and there was actually a park right there, right off of the Potomac River. And fortunately, that plane was taken down, albeit at the cost of all those lives on board.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine. I had two close friends that worked at a satellite office of 17 people in the North Tower, and 15 of the 17 lost their lives on 9/11, and they happened not to be in the office that day. So it's just, and when you talk about, the plane that was heading for the Pentagon and, that whole, how it was documented, what they did, just incredible. I mean, so yeah, I can't even imagine.
Just to link back to my experience in ROTC in college, on that day, one of my former cadre members, he was then a colonel, Mark Volk. He worked in the Army G3, the sort of the operations arm of headquarters department of the Army. With the plane hit just below where his offices were, and he went out to, it was called the E ring. It's the outside ring, where there were some of the very senior folks, and he went and made sure that people were evacuated, and this is thick smoke, fire, heat, and all that. He was ultimately awarded the Soldier's Medal, which is the highest award for heroism not involving direct combat.
Wow.
Again, these were the kind of folks that helped train me when I was still in college. And again, to this day, we're close friends. When he retired from the Army, he became the president of Lackawanna College in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and he's since retired from that. But just a phenomenal and one of the most humble people you'd ever want to meet.
Yeah, so let's talk about what at the end of your Army career. So you retired in 2018. Did you have any idea what you wanted to do? Did you have a plan?
As many times as I counseled people who worked with me as they were getting ready to retire, and told them, make sure you take the time and plan before you get out. And I was guilty of really not taking my own advice. I did some preparation, but not nearly what I should have. I kind of, sprinted through the finish line of my career and didn't really take the time that I probably should have to prepare. So I was a little behind the eight ball, but ultimately, had some good opportunities. My family was already here in Kansas City. They moved out here in 2011. We were in the DC area. I was at the Pentagon. I was on my way to Afghanistan. We had already bought a house here because we knew eventually when it was time to settle down, this is where we were going to do it. And so they came out here in 2011. After I left Afghanistan, I came out to Fort Leavenworth, spent a couple years, was getting ready to retire, and never thought in a million years thought I would come out on get promoted again. And we had already told our kids, hey, this is it. My daughter started 7th grade when she came out here. My son started 10th grade. We said, you don't have to move again. You can finish school here. So I wound up spending my last 4 years on the East Coast, 2 in the Pentagon and then 2 down in the Tidewater area, Newport News, Virginia. I knew I was going to stay. We were going to stay here in Kansas City. We love it here. Had some good opportunities, but the fit didn't seem quite right. So I took some time, and then I decided, you know what? What I really want to do is I really want to help others to create great culture in their organizations. I had worked in organizations that had phenomenal culture, and I knew how that made me feel, how productive it made everyone in the organization and the organization as a whole, how I was able to leave work and have energy to do things with my family, to be present with them. And then on the flip side, I was in several organizations that the exact opposite was the truth. So I said, if there was a way that I could help companies build great company culture, that's what I want to do. So I started, set up my own coaching business, started working on my book. We can talk about that later. Wow, it took me a lot longer than I ever thought it would, and was a lot harder than I ever thought it would be. I became a student of culture when I turned probably about 16 years old. Got my first job. It was in a department store, Bradley's department store. Kind of think of a Target, kind of like store in a mall. I noticed it was like two different stores. We had a general manager, but then we had two assistant managers. And one assistant manager was over what we called soft lines, so clothes, shoes, domestics, those types of things. And then the other assistant manager was over hard lines, was in charge of hard lines, automotive, home improvement, sporting goods, health and beauty, those types of things. And it was like two completely different stores. And it had nothing to do with what kind of products we sold. I'd look over at the other side of the store, and boy, everyone had smiles on their faces. And when you saw them in the break room or before or after work, they always seemed like they were in a good mood. And our side of the store, it was like there was this rain cloud consistently over our side of the store. And I was like, how can this be? So as I thought about it, and I worked there a couple of years, part-time. To me, it came down to the leaders. It's about the two assistant managers. So that's kind of what I thought. That's what drives culture. So I set out to learn as much as I could about leadership, develop my leadership capabilities to the best of my abilities, because I thought that's going to be it. This is what it's all about, leadership. So I got to my first organization in the Army, and I said, if I exhibit good leadership, then we're going to have great culture in this organization. And it didn't necessarily work out quite like that. So I started looking at other organizations, and I had been studying this, not just in organizations I was in, but in other organizations. And I said, there's got to be more to it than that. So, this is a really long way of saying that I've spent literally the last 40 years of my life being a student and a practitioner of developing great culture in organizations. Now, not always successfully. I've made probably every mistake that you could possibly make a couple times. But that's what I wanted to do was share what I'd learned over those years, to be able to help others. My dream, sort of my cosmic dream, would be that we lived in a world where everyone loves where they work. And I know that's only possible if everyone works in an organization that has exceptional culture that matches what they're looking for. That's only going to happen if CEOs know how to develop that great culture, that kind of culture. So, and to me, that's world changing. Think about if everybody left work every day and instead of feeling drained, felt energized because they thought they were part of something bigger than themselves, that their work was appreciated and recognized, and that they learned something and they enjoyed the people that they worked with, they felt safe. Think about what better members of their community and their families they would be if that were the case.
Yeah, 100%. So a couple different things that you said there. I mean, I love that you said having the energy to really be a better human being, right? whether your role as a parent or spouse or friend, family member. So that I've never heard it put that way. And the other thing that really resonated with me also was I just don't understand it. Like I've worked for like 12, 13 different companies. Like, and we have all these best companies to work for lists. Like, why isn't every company the best company to work for? Like, we have to have a list. I get it. It should be the goal of every CEO and executive leadership team to create the best culture they can. But it's just not. It doesn't happen. It should be like, that's the default mentality. Let's be doing something, that we're doing something greater than ourselves, and there's a mission, and people feel good when they leave. And really, you're right. It would make the world a better place if everybody left energized, because you're only as good as your energy level, and if you only get so much per day and you get it drained at your workplace, it's less energy you have for your loved ones, right? So yeah, I love that. Outside of the military, Dave, and whether you met these people or not, it doesn't matter, but did you have leadership mentors?
I did, and they came in various forms. Oftentimes, they were people that I'd met in the community, whether it be through church or some other activity, who, as I got to know them, I realized that they were exceptional leaders. Unfortunately, coming up, the late 80s, early 90s, it was much more difficult to keep track of folks. Oftentimes I would lose contact with some of those mentors. But I tell you, over the last 15, 20 years or so, it's been much easier to continue to work with mentors and get them to, people that have already been where you are, maybe not in the Army, but, have been leaders in their own right, in their own organizations. And it could be a business, it could be a nonprofit, it could be, it could be a place of worship, could be a church organization or something like that. Just having that different perspective was always beneficial to me.
Yeah, I mean, you learn from everybody. I totally agree with that. But so you, like, shortly after you leave the Army, though, you have this idea about writing a book. Was that like always in you, or like that you just thought you wanted to write this kind of book on culture? What was the driving force behind the book?
I think it's always been in me. It's really for this reason is, if I'm going to try to make the world a better place, I've got to be able to share with people what I've learned along the way, the mistakes I've made, so hopefully they won't make it. And I realized early on, it took me about 10 years in the Army to sort of get culture, to realize that, hey, it's more than just the leader. There's other aspects of that. And once I understood that, the next 25 years I took to develop, mature, experiment with, and modify a framework around how to build great company culture. And this goes back to your point is, why isn't every place a great place to work? Why isn't every place, all their employees, love working there, and their customers and clients, they treasure working with that company. It's what I learned going through the School of Hard Knocks for over 3 decades, is that there are very few places that people will help you understand how to build great company culture. There's tons of books out there about, what makes up great culture, why it's important, should we care. I mean, shoot, I think Ken Blanchard has written or co-written 50, 60 books. John Maxwell, I think he's up to 80 or 100 books. And I read those books, I go, wow, this is great. These are some great ideas. There's people that tackle an aspect of building great culture, like Simon Sinek. But how do you put it all together? How do you actually do it? What I realized, again, over a course of 25, 30 years at least, you've got to have a methodology. You got to have a concrete way of doing this. That was really the purpose behind my writing the book. And as I was researching it, and again, this wasn't just researching the last 2-3 years. This is decades of research. I realized that everyone talks about great culture. And so my hypothesis is that almost everyone believes culture is important. They want to have great culture, but they don't really know how to do it. And that really played out as I continued my research over the last, say 3 years, 3.5 years. I interview CEOs. First question I always ask them is culture important? I've yet to have anyone say no. I think in their heart, I think most everyone believes that. But then I ask them, okay, so what kind of culture are you trying to build in this company? Here's where that funnel starts narrowing very rapidly. The number of CEOs that have a clear, descriptive definition of what they want to build, what kind of culture they want to build in their organization, I would say is probably less than 1 in 10. We'd get a lot of answers like, oh, I want to be inclusive. I want to be, this, that. You're just sort of these platitudes. And I would say, no. What does it look, sound, taste, smell, and feel like to work in this company or to work with this company? And you get a lot of, oh, okay. And then once they've worked through that and have a clear description, the next question I was asking them is, okay, so how do you do it? They're typical response, well, what do you mean? How do I do it? Well, you just described a future state you're trying to achieve in your company. So you must have a strategy to get there, a way to implement that strategy, and a way to measure progress, right? Of the last 200 plus CEOs I've talked to, only 3 were able to say, oh, here, let me show you how we do it. And that's not to poke anyone in the eye. I spent decades in that state in leading organizations. Some of these CEOs that say, no, I don't really know, we don't really have a concrete way to do this. Some of them 5-10 minutes prior told me that as a CEO, the most important thing that they did was cultivate their company's culture. And again, not to this is not intended to poke anyone in the eye. And that's really what my book does. So what my book does is it talks about, okay, how do you define and describe the kind of culture you're trying to build in your organization? And then how do you build a strategy to achieve that? With any strategy, one thing that you have to have is some sort of framework. And this is really what the part that I've spent the last 20, 25 years working on is, what's the framework? What are the pillars, the elements of culture you have to address in your strategy? And where I'm at now, and this is something I continue to refine as I learn more, as I talk to people and get their thoughts and their ideas. The pillars are purpose, the leader, people, process, and communication. And what I do is I talk to CEOs and we go through each of those pillars. And I ask them, each of those elements, I call them, I said, what are the observable behaviors in each of these areas, each of these elements that will move your organization, your company from where it is today to where you're trying to build your culture? What does that future state look like? And then once you've done that, you've developed your strategy, then you've got to implement that strategy. You've got to be able to, take that strategy, turn it into meaningful action to achieve your objectives. In this state, your desired culture, and you've got to measure progress. And just like you would if one of your objectives was to increase revenue by 25% this year, well, you're going to have a way to measure that. You're going to have milestones. You're going to review that. And it's not just going to be, sort of, hey, when we get to the end of the year, we'll see where we are. You're going to have, okay, hey, every month first Monday of every month, we're going to review all of our, whether you use objectives and key results or KPIs or whatever you want to call them. You're going to review that over time, and you're going to see, hey, we're not making the progress we thought we were going to make. So let's take a look at what we're doing and make some adjustments. Well, it's the same thing trying to build a culture. In my book, I talk about the governance. How does a company, no kidding, do that? And there's some great examples out there. I'm talking about when Kelleher was the CEO of Southwest. As I talk to people that work at Southwest today, it appears to me that they do not have the kind of culture they had when Herb Kelleher was the CEO there. So that's really what the gist of my book is. It's a how-to book. I think one of the reasons it took me so long is because I was trying to write a book that was as concise as possible without leaving out some important elements. So, in fact, I just got the formatted draft back last night from the company that's doing the production on the book, and it's all told 149 pages. And if you strip out stuff up front, it's probably like 125, 130 pages, something like that. One of my objectives was to write a book that a CEO could read on one domestic plane flight. And each chapter, at the end of each chapter, I give the reader 3 things to think about that's going to help, reinforce and, really get them moving. And then after those 3 things to think about, I give them 3 action steps to take. So it's almost has a workbook kind of quality in it. So what I didn't want to do is I didn't want to write a book rather that someone reads this, oh, there's some really interesting ideas in here, and they put it on the shelf. My goal was that when someone reads that book, and I've already had CEOs that have done this because I had some beta readers, and I had some folks that got a final draft because they wrote, they wanted to read it, and they wrote me reviews for it already. They were like, hey, we're already working on, we're on chapter 3. So, we've already described the culture that we're trying to achieve. The next thing is now we're developing the strategy. When it comes to business books, again, I think it's a fairly brief book. And I even mentioned in chapter 1, which is really the introduction, that each one of the chapters in this book could be a book on it by itself.
You posted on LinkedIn whether the cover art should be red or blue. I voted blue, and I believe that's the color I went with. It was just the majority. I'm sure it wasn't just my vote. But I saw the legendary.
No, it was you. Everyone else wanted red, but I said no. I said Jeff wants blue. I'm going with that.
There you go. Well, it's my high school colors. We were the Sailors, so we were blue and white. So it's all good. But I saw on the cover you have the legendary CEO from WD-40, Gary Ridge, gives like a testimonial quote for the book. I mean, do you know Gary?
I do. In fact, he wrote the foreword for the book.
Oh, wow.
That little quote up there is pulled out of the foreword. I met him. This was during COVID. I had heard so many things about WD-40 and about their culture that, it's really astonishing. So Gallup will tell you that currently about 1/3 of every U.S. employee is engaged, meaning that they are actively pursuing the goals of the company at work. At WD-40, that's 93%. You talk about somebody who's, a company that's an outlier in a positive way. It was WD-40. So I was like, well, shoot, I need to read his book. So I read his first book. He's written 2 since then. In fact, is one of his most recent ones he co-wrote with Ken Blanchard. So I was like, wow, this is really something. I need to talk to him. So this was a unintended good consequence, I think, of COVID. I literally just sent him a LinkedIn in-mail and said, hey, Mr. Ridge, my name's Dave Komar. I'm a retired Army general. I'm writing a book about culture, and I read your book, and these are some things that stood out to me. Is there any way I could, if you could spare some time, I would love to, I'd love to sit down and talk to you about it. Well, the very next day he sent me a note back. Said, "Oh, absolutely." He CC'd Holly as executive assistant. Said, "Get with Holly, and we'll find a time." So he actually spent about 3 hours with me,
Wow.
and I was just like flabbergasted. And one of the things he mentioned, he goes, "Well, he goes, I have so much more time now because I don't have to travel." He said, in fact, one of the things he does on his calendar so that people don't just fill it up with everything, uh, and he still has time to think, is he actually puts on his calendar, even though he's not traveling, he puts flight time. So that would typically be some, time where, no one's going to be able to interrupt him. No one's going to be able to call him, that has dedicated to, really thinking about, his organization and how to move that organization forward. But he just retired in last December after, I think, about 25 years. He was the CEO and the chairman of WD-40. And, you think about what WD-40 has done with their brand and their success over the last 25 or 30 years. I would say it's one of the most recognized. You show that can of WD-40, it's I think one of the most recognizable things. Everyone in the world knows what that is, and it's oil in a can.
Exactly.
It's not anything sexy. They have a great origin story that I won't take your time up here, but the very, very short story is there was a corrosion in one of the space programs. I can't remember which one it was. They were trying to develop a formula that would solve that corrosion problem, and they failed 39 times, and the 40th time was successful, and that's why it's WD-40.
Wow. Nice. Nice.
I do have to say this one thing, because tell you, Gary's a phenomenal guy. And in fact, I attended a culture summit, culture forum out at the end of October in San Diego that he was helping host. But one of the things that impresses me the most is, and I talk about this in my book, nobody makes mistakes at WD-40. They have learning moments. And those learning moments can be positive or they could be negative. As much as people like to say, "Wow, our leadership's really good about not shooting the messenger," and and that's great. If that's in fact the case, that's fantastic. What they do at WD-40 Company is they actually celebrate people who have had learning moments, even negative learning moments, and encourage them to share that with others so that other folks can learn from what's happening. Um, and I tell you, having now spent some time in person with Gary, he's all real.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. I love that. And that might lead into the question I'm going to ask you next, because I love helping two groups of people on this podcast. One is that recent college graduate that is now looking for their first professional job. What advice would you have for them, Dave, as they begin their professional career journey?
Well, my first piece of advice is join the military. And I know that's not for everyone. Not everyone has the proclivity or the desire to do that. But I tell you, it's one experience that, I don't have the statistics to support it, but I talked over the last 30, 40 years, I've talked to a lot of folks, not in the military, not in the military. And I almost never run into someone who says that they regret the time they spent in the military. In fact, usually the opposite. They're like, "Oh, I should have stayed. I could be retired now," or, I always think back fondly at that time. But if they're not going to do that, my advice to them is to not be so worried about the type of work that they find. Now, I know if someone's just got their bachelor's degree in electrical engineering or chemical engineering or something, they're going to want to work in that so they can get their, become professional engineer certified. They've got some gates for that. I understand that. But in general, think more about the kind of company that you're working for. What is that company's culture like? Because it doesn't matter what it is you want to do. If you find a job in a company that you just hate working there, you're not going to learn very much. About the only thing you're going to wind up taking away for the rest of your career are some examples of how not to do things as opposed to how to do things. Spend some research. I speak to groups of people that are transitioning from one career or one position to another. I was talking to a very large group in Nashville, and I said, do some research, go online. You can go. Okay, I get it. Glassdoor. People are typically more inclined to go on there if they have a negative experience, a positive experience. I get that, but hey, if it's a brick and mortar work, people are either everyone's in the facility or they work hybrid. You know what? Go park in their parking lot at 7:30 in the morning and see what people look like. What's the expression on their face when they're walking into work? Are they, are they kind of stepping lightly and like they're can't wait to get in there and interact with the other people they work with and do their, perform their tasks? Or they just kind of drag it in there and do the same thing in the evening when people are leaving the office or whatever the facility is. Are people talking to each other? Are they joking with each other? Is everyone just got their head down, going to the car, saying, "Oh my gosh, thank goodness this is over until tomorrow." Yeah, so just, do some investigation and be more concerned about the kind of company you work for.
I've interviewed over 60 people on the podcast to date, and that has never been mentioned, but I love that. That is because that's telling in a lot of ways. So thank you for that, Dave. The other group, as people, become leaders, at least from a org chart standpoint, now they're responsible for a team of people. What advice would you give them as they begin their leadership journey?
Well, hopefully they have already, in preparation for becoming a leader in an organization, hopefully they've already been educating themselves, that they've been observing those people in the organization that are in leadership positions, identifying behaviors that they think they would like to also exhibit because it has a positive impact on the organization, that they're observing behaviors in other leaders that they don't want to emulate because it's having a negative impact on the organization. And then that you write down, what is your leadership philosophy? What's important to you? And share that with people. When you go into that position, share that with people. And you've got to be vulnerable and say, hey, if I'm not doing these things, I need to know, because this is what behaviors I want to be exhibiting. And Harry Campbell talks about this in one of his books quite a bit. He's got, I don't know what this was, it the 7 words or 7 terms or something. In fact, you can even go to Harry Campbell's webpage and there's a survey you can send out to people, and they will then choose descriptors, and it'll send you back, hey, these are the most common descriptors that were given to you. It's very similar to that. So, it's got to be about learning and growth, not just so that you can be a better leader, but that you can do a better job leading the people whom you've been charged with leading.
Yeah, totally great. I've done that 7-word exercise that Harry has. So it is great. And I tell all the recent college graduates that come to me for career advice to do that exercise, because it definitely gives you some perspective on yourself that you wouldn't probably have. Dave, your book is called Conquer Your Culture. When is the publication date?
Well, I just literally last night approved the cover design. So the production is going through. I think that it will probably launch somewhere around mid-February. I'll be posting on my LinkedIn updates as it goes along. But again, boy, this is the first book I've ever written. I decided to self-publish because I wanted to have 100% control over the content. This book is very much my life's work. I didn't want someone else to be able to say, no, we're not going to include that story, or we're going to take this chapter out, or something like that. Or so, I don't know if that's vanity or what, but I just wanted to have that control. Plus, it's nice if you self-publish next year or 2 years from now, when I put out a second edition, I can do that. I don't have to ask Mother May I to anyone.
Right. I love that strategy.
So it's been an experience. That's one of the reasons there's books about writing books.
Right.
Because there's a lot to learn, and just doing the writing part, which I thought was going to be about 80 or 90% of it, is probably turned out to be about 50% of it.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to read the book when it comes out. I love culture. I could talk about culture all day long. I love that your consulting and speaking, as well as the book, focuses on the CEOs, because the culture has to start there. Great ones, at least, have to start there. So, I'm excited to see, your business grow, and thank you for coming on the Corporate Couch today.
No, I sure appreciate it. And I'd love to offer all of your listeners a free consultation if they would be interested. They can reach me on the website at edainc.io.
Great. Yeah, and I'll put that in the episode notes too, so the link will be there when they listen to your great story. So, thanks again, Dave. Have a happy holiday.
Well, thank you. You as well.
Another great conversation with one of the leaders that we've talked to that served in the military. Dave served 31 years in the Army. Just incredible leadership experiences there. I mean, I could talk about that. It's all about culture. And he retired in 2019 after 31 years. And I said, why focus on culture? And did you have a plan when you retired? He said, no, even though I tell people they need to have a plan. I didn't have a plan. And how he talked about when he was 16 and he worked at Bradley's department store, which was a Northeast department store. And he said there was a general manager of the store, and then there was a manager of the soft lines and a manager of the hard lines. I forget which one he worked for, but he worked for the bad manager.
He worked for the other one, whatever it was.
Yeah. And he said we hated our jobs, hated it, and the opposite department loved working there. And at 16 he made the decision, or made the observation, well, it's all about leadership. The leadership creates the culture. Mm-hmm. And I experienced that with a couple of my companies. One was Eritana. It was every department, functional area, R&D and accounting, finance, sales and marketing, HR and administrative, all had different cultures. It was kind of a strange thing, but it makes sense because it's the leadership under those functional areas that drive the culture.
The leadership is the thing. It's like leadership trickles down, right? You don't have to believe in gravity for it to affect everything.
Yeah, and then he said, you made an entire career over 40 years, 31 years in the military, being a lifelong learner of how to develop a great culture. And he said, I made mistakes, of course, so he writes a book on it because he wants to have a framework with all his ideas. And, the crazy stuff was, his research. We interviewed 100 CEOs, and only 10% even had a description of the culture they wanted. And so that's crazy in itself. Like, okay, because it's like motherhood, apple pie, in the old days, Chevrolet. Everybody believes in that. It's like every company wants a great culture. no one argues with that. And he said 100% of the people he interviewed, but only 10% of the CEOs could describe what that culture would look like. And then the ones that did, another survey, 2 of 300 had any idea of how to implement the culture they wanted to have.
Mm-hmm.
So his book is, which will come out in late February, I believe is the launch date, is all about the framework. So I just thought it was phenomenal.
Yeah, it was a great interview. I enjoyed every minute of it. It was amazing. One of the things that it did with me is it reminded me back to my days as a senior in high school. I remember that when I was a senior in high school, a Army recruiter came to give the senior class an aptitude test, if you will, and to give a big speech on everybody ought to join the Army right now. If you want to feel sorry for somebody, feel sorry for an Army recruiter in 1974. And I genuinely felt sorry for the guy because, the war was winding down. The draft was over, so we knew we were all safe from the draft. And there wasn't anybody in my whole high school class that wanted to be talking to an Army recruiter. Matter of fact, I can't name one person in my high school class of 110 people that joined the armed forces of any kind. But one of the things that struck me when he was giving his little speech was he said, the Army is an organization of process. And there is a right way to do things and a wrong way and the Army way. And that's one of the things that Dave brought out in his talk was he was talking about that everything in the Army does is a deliberate process. And why in the world can't we have those kind of deliberate processes in everything that we do? So not only is he trying to instill a culture, but also the importance of processes within organizations. And I love listening to stories about 9/11. That's just kind of a thing with me. I don't know, maybe it's a little bit morbid or something, but anybody that was actually there and went through it and was actually in the Pentagon when the planes hit, it's just, I'm just enthralled by listening to the stories like that. It was an amazing interview all the way around.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because this is our third guest on the podcast. It was Eastman McGovern would have been in one of the World Trade Towers on 9/11 and had a doctor's appointment. He would have died. All people in this company that were there passed that day on 9/11. Pamela Norton should have been there for her company at the time, and she was ousted. So she by the acquiring company, and now, Dave was in the Pentagon when it all shook down. It was just unbelievable.
It's amazing stories.
Yeah. Well, what leadership advice would you want to give our great listeners today, Joe?
Well, sticking in the same vein, we are going to go to that great philosopher named John Wayne. And John Wayne one time said, "Life is hard, but life is harder if you're stupid."
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Corporate Couch. If you enjoy the podcast, I would love for you to take 2 minutes out of your day to rate us 5 stars and write a review. Please join me next week to learn from another great leader sharing their professional journey and insights.